So, it is 1937, and I want you to imagine you're walking into this packed theater in a small American city.
Right.
But, here's the thing you really have to keep in mind about this. For a huge portion of the people taking their seats right around you, this town has actually never had a professional playhouse before. Like, never.
Oh, wow.
You
Yeah.
are sitting next to people who are about to experience live professional theater for the very first time in their entire lives.
The energy in that room would be, just absolutely electric.
Totally.
You're looking at a community that has been economically battered by the Great Depression.
Right.
And suddenly, they're being given this massive cultural gift.
Yeah, the air is just buzzing, and the seats are filled to the absolute brim because the show you're about to see is completely free. Or, at most it costs you maybe a few pennies.
Right, exactly.
But as the curtain goes up, the actors on stage, they aren't performing some dusty drawing room comedy about British aristocrats.
No, definitely not.
They aren't doing Shakespeare in tights either. Instead, they are performing something called a living newspaper.
Which was totally radical departure from what anyone considered, traditional theater at the time.
It sounds so bizarre to modern ears.
It was. It was this completely new form of storytelling that was really born out of necessity and just the unique circumstances of the era.
So the actors on the stage, they're playing tenants facing eviction. They're playing landlords demanding rent from people who have literally nothing left.
Real visceral stuff.
Exactly. They're playing power company executives making these backdoor deals that keep prices artificially high. And there's an actual chorus on stage, and they are reading aloud from real verbatim newspaper headlines that were just printed that very morning.
Which is just incredible.
Right. I want you to really imagine this experience. You are sitting in a theater, watching a play about your own electric bills, your own rent, your own daily grinding struggles to survive the Depression.
Yeah, it hits really close to home.
And the most astonishing part of all of this, the federal government is footing the entire bill.
It really stands as one of the most remarkable experiments in the history of public policy.
It really does.
The United States government is directly paying unemployed actors to stage real-time documentary theater about the lives of average citizens.
Yeah.
They are essentially funding a mirror for society to look into.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the mission for our deep dive today is to explore the absolute high watermark of Federal One.
Right.
For those who aren't familiar, Federal One was the cultural wing of the Works Progress Administration, or, the WPA.
The big New Deal program.
Exactly. And we're going to examine this massive cultural dividend by comparing two enormous ambitious programs that operated under its umbrella. So that's the Federal Theater Project and the Federal Music Project.
Two very different beasts.
Very different. We're going to look at how the government managed to put free theater in 40 different states and an orchestra in practically every region of the country. And most importantly, we're going to figure out exactly why one of these programs was brutally killed off by political hostility, while the other one survived.
Yeah, the contrast between those two programs is where the real historical insight lies, I think.
For sure.
To understand what happened, we really have to look at the visionaries behind these projects, the specific kind of art they chose to produce, and, well, how the political establishment reacted when public art suddenly started telling uncomfortable truths.
So we need to start with the architect of that theater project. How did this unprecedented, massive national theater even come to be?
It all begins with a woman named Hallie Flanagan.
Okay.
In 1935, she was appointed as the National Director of the Federal Theater Project, which we'll probably just call the FTP.
Right, FTP. So who was she? Was she a politician? Like some bureaucrat?
Not at all. Flanagan was a highly respected drama professor at Vassar College, where she actually directed their experimental theater.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, she was a creator, she was an academic, and someone with a really deep international perspective on the arts. She had actually conducted this extensive survey of European theater, which was funded by a Guggenheim Fellowship, before taking on this government role.
That's a pretty serious pedigree.
It is. So she came into this not as a government administrator just looking to push papers, but as a genuine visionary who really understood the global power of the stage.
But wait, I'm stuck on something right from the jump here.
What's that?
If we look at the context of 1935, the country is in the depths of the Great Depression. The WPA was created as an emergency relief program, like literally about keeping people from starving to death.
Right, absolutely.
So isn't it wildly irresponsible to put an experimental theater professor in charge of relief funds? The initial logic for creating the Federal Theater Project wasn't about creating avant-garde art, right? It was purely economic.
It was totally economic at first.
Sure. Yeah, there's this famous quote from Harry Hopkins, the head of the WPA, who said that unemployed theater professionals have got to eat just like other people.
And that right there is the fundamental tension that defined the entire project from day one.
Yeah.
Hopkins is looking at actors, directors, stagehands, set designers, playwrights who are standing in bread lines. His mandate from the Roosevelt administration is simple. Get these people a paycheck so they can survive.
Right.
He really isn't necessarily concerned with what they're putting on stage just as long as they're working. But Flanagan, she sees something much, much bigger.
What does she see?
Well, where Hopkins sees a temporary relief measure, Flanagan sees this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to build a genuinely national American theater, like practically overnight.
I really want to emphasize the scale of what she built because the numbers in our sources are just staggering.
They're huge.
She employed roughly 10,000 theater professionals, and they mounted around 1,000 distinct productions across 40 different states.
It's hard to even wrap your head around.
It is. It's like trying to build Broadway from scratch, but putting it in every single state simultaneously, using only people who are currently out of work. It's a logistical nightmare just thinking about it.
It is a logistical and, honestly, an artistic miracle that it functioned at all.
Right.
You have to remember, they are pulling these companies together straight from the unemployment rolls. They're finding abandoned theaters, warehouses, literally any space they can use, and they're putting up these massive productions.
But I have to push back firmly on Flanagan's motivations here.
Okay, good.
If the mandate from the government was just to give people jobs, why didn't she just put on safe, easy drawing room comedies? Why didn't she just do standard vaudeville routines that wouldn't ruffle any feathers?
That's a very common question.
Wasn't she essentially hijacking federal relief funds to build her own personal sandbox for her avant-garde theater dreams? I mean, why didn't Congress immediately shut that down?
What's fascinating here is that Flanagan didn't see those two goals, relief and great art, as mutually exclusive. In fact, she believed they were entirely dependent on each other. Flanagan firmly believed that theater shouldn't just be cheap escapism, especially during a severe national crisis like the Depression.
So she wanted it to mean something.
Exactly. She believed it should engage the urgent, bleeding questions of the moment. And by bringing live professional theater to regions that commercial stages in New York or Chicago had entirely ignored, she was fundamentally altering the cultural landscape of the country.
Wow.
She wasn't just feeding hungry actors. She believed she was feeding a culturally starved nation, and she was doing it by forcing them to look in the mirror.
So she wasn't hiding her ambition at all. She was just leaning right into it.
Completely. She was unapologetic about the fact that if the government was going to fund theater, it needed to be theater that mattered.
So if we know the massive scale of this operation, 10,000 people working across 40 states, what were they actually putting on stage that started drawing so much attention? Because as you said, they weren't just doing quiet little regional plays to collect a paycheck.
No, they were doing incredibly bold, structurally innovative work. And one of the most vital and historically significant components of the Federal Theater Project was the Negro theater units.
Oh, this is a crucial part of the story.
Yes, very much so.
These were segregated units, which obviously reflects the grim, systemic reality of America in the 1930s. But it's really important to note that these were professionally serious companies.
Absolutely.
They gave Black actors, Black directors, and Black playwrights something that was incredibly rare, almost non-existent at the time, which was federally paid work in their own profession.
Exactly. Prior to this, Black theater professionals were largely locked out of mainstream commercial theater, or, they were relegated to deeply stereotypical roles.
Right.
The FTP gave them the funding and the infrastructure to produce serious art. And the most famous of these units was the Harlem unit in New York.
Oh, yes.
The work they produced there wasn't just, quote, good for a relief project, unquote. It was culturally groundbreaking on a national level.
Which brings us to one of the most famous theatrical productions in American history. The Voodoo Macbeth.
Yes. Such an amazing moment.
It's March 1936 at the Lafayette Theater in Harlem. We have a 20-year-old Orson Welles, and just take a second to process that, 20 years old, taking federal funds, and his producer, John Houseman.
It's crazy how young he was.
I know. They take Shakespeare's Macbeth, but they don't do it in Scottish kilts on some dreary moor. They relocate the entire setting of the play to a Haitian court, modeled after the reign of Henri Christophe. And they cast it entirely with black actors.
It is hard to overstate what a massive sensation this was.
I bet.
Moving the setting to a Haitian court entirely recontextualized the play. It brought in elements of Caribbean culture, totally different rhythmic structures to the sound design, and a visual palette that just completely shattered how Shakespeare was traditionally presented.
And people loved it, right?
It sold out completely. On opening night, they literally had to shut down the blocks surrounding the Lafayette Theater because the crowds trying to get in were so massive.
That is incredible.
It was a cultural earthquake in Harlem, and it eventually toured nationally.
It proved that federally funded theater didn't have to be boring. It could be avant-garde, critically acclaimed, visually stunning, and wildly popular all at the exact same time.
And it also proved that there was a massive, untapped audience for serious black theater in America.
But as wildly popular and acclaimed as the Negro theater units were, the thing that really defined the federal theater project and the thing that eventually put a massive political target on its back were those living newspapers we talked about at the very beginning.
Yes, the living newspapers.
Right.
If Flanagan had only produced Shakespeare, even radical adaptations of Shakespeare, the FTP might have actually survived.
Really?
Yeah, probably. But the living newspapers were different. This was a unique documentary drama format that they essentially invented for this moment. They quite literally built full-length plays from real news and contemporary social conflict.
How does that actually work mechanically? I mean, you don't just walk on stage and read an article out loud. That sounds terrible.
Right, no, it was highly theatrical. They utilized a massive cast. They would have a character known as the voice of the living newspaper speaking over a loudspeaker, acting almost like an omniscient narrator or a radio broadcaster.
Okay, that makes sense.
They would use projection screens to show actual statistics, photographs, and political cartoons. And then, down on the stage, actors would dramatize those statistics.
Like little vignettes.
Exactly. They would play out short, punchy scenes, a farmer losing his land, a family being evicted, a politician making a speech. It was incredibly fast-paced, very cinematic in its structure, and really designed to make complex economic and social issues immediately understandable and emotionally resonant.
Let's give some specific examples from our sources, because the topics they chose were not subtle.
No, not at all.
You had a play called Power, which was entirely about public utilities, the monopoly of power companies, and the crushing cost of electricity for average people.
A huge issue at the time.
Then you had One-Third of a Nation, which was a deep dive into the crisis of slum housing, predatory landlords, and just the lack of safe living conditions in cities.
Right.
And you had AAA Plowed Under, which tackled the brutal realities of agriculture and farming, specifically the controversial Agricultural Adjustment Act, where crops were actually being destroyed to raise prices while people were literally starving.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you really have to imagine the audience reaction to these specific plays.
Okay.
You have average citizens, many of whom are personally suffering through the exact crises being depicted on stage, sitting in a theater and seeing their own lives portrayed with total validation.
That must have been so powerful.
For a lot of these people, it was the first time they felt seen by the culture at large. The plays were vital, they were incredibly popular, and they were deeply, inextricably integrated into the political moment. They were explicitly taking the side of the tenants, the displaced farmers, and the struggling labor unions.
But this is where the danger comes in, right? If they were dramatizing real news, how did they avoid crossing the line into political campaigning? I mean, taking the side of a tenant against a landlord in a federally funded play seems like a very precarious place to be.
That is the million-dollar question, and the short answer is, to their critics, they didn't avoid it at all.
He just leaned in.
By dramatizing the suffering of the poor and showing systemic failure as the root cause of that suffering, the plays inherently supported the New Deal's regulatory and relief policies. They weren't coming out on stage and holding up a sign that said, "Vote for Roosevelt," but they were saying, the system is broken, the monopolies are greedy, and the working man needs government protection.
Right.
And that message happened to be the exact foundational argument of the administration that was signing their paychecks.
So if you're a conservative politician who opposes the New Deal, you don't see this as a documentary. You see this as a taxpayer-funded campaign rally.
Precisely. You see it as the Roosevelt administration using federal relief money to stage its own political advertisements.
Okay, so that sets the stage for the explosive, highly topical energy of the theater project. Now, I want to pivot and contrast that with its sibling program under Federal One.
the music project.
Right, a program that was quieter, actually larger in scale, and far, far less controversial. Let's look at the Federal Music Project.
The Federal Music Project, or the FMP, was led by a man named Nikolai Sokoloff.
Okay.
His background is fascinatingly different from Flanagan's. He was a Russian-born conductor who had previously led the Cleveland Orchestra. He was appointed as the national director of the FMP in 1935, right alongside Flanagan's appointment to the theater project.
But his vision for what a relief project should be couldn't have been more different from hers. Where Flanagan reached for the topical, the immediate, the messy social conflicts of the day, Sokoloff reached for the permanent and the classical.
Sokoloff was a strict traditionalist. His priority was the establishment of rigorous, professional musical standards and the creation of lasting, permanent institutions.
He wasn't trying to start a revolution.
No, he wasn't interested in social commentary at all. He wasn't trying to hold a mirror up to the political struggles of the Depression. He was interested in symphonies. He wanted to elevate the cultural palette of the American public by exposing them to high art.
And the scale of the FMP is just mind-boggling. They put about 16,000 musicians to work.
Yeah.
That's significantly larger than the theater project. They founded roughly 34 symphony orchestras. And again, just like the theater project reaching new audiences, many of these orchestras were founded in cities that had never, ever had a symphony orchestra before.
The logistics of that are just incredible.
Right.
You can't just gather 100 unemployed people and say, okay, play Beethoven. You have to find trained musicians, organize rehearsal spaces, secure instruments, find conductors, and build an infrastructure for classical music where literally none previously existed.
That's a massive undertaking.
And they weren't just playing elite concerts for the wealthy either. The core of their mission was accessibility. They gave free and incredibly low-cost concerts to the general public.
They were doing a lot more than just concerts, too, according to the sources.
Yes, the educational component was massive. They taught music to children all across the country. They ran extensive teacher training programs to improve music education in schools.
Oh, that's great.
And in a completely different vein, they sent out ethnomusicologists and collectors to record and preserve American folk songs, specifically in rural areas, before those oral traditions just vanished from the cultural memory.
The numbers detailing the reach of the FMP are almost hard to wrap your head around. By November 1937, roughly 35.4 million people had attended Federal Music Project events.
Wow.
35.4 million. In a country that had a much smaller population than today, that is a staggering percentage of Americans interacting with this program.
It really is.
Break this down for me, because that includes about 39,219 symphony and concert programs, 24,414 band concerts, and 369 opera and operetta performances.
When you look at those numbers and you compare the social impact of the two programs side by side, it is very revealing about how art functions in society.
How so?
The FMP provided immense community enrichment, baseline education, and vital cultural preservation. It was about elevating the community through exposure to the classics and providing music lessons to kids whose parents could never afford them.
Okay.
The FTP, on the other hand, provided immediate, provocative documentary reflections on contemporary struggles. One program sought to soothe and elevate, the other sought to agitate and expose.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. I want to push back on this prevailing idea that one of these programs was inherently safe while the other was inherently dangerous.
All right, let's hear it.
Because honestly, isn't classical music or deciding which folk songs to preserve just as ideological as theater?
In what way?
Well, if Sokoloff is deciding that a European symphony represents the pinnacle of American culture that needs to be subsidized, while ignoring other forms of music, that's a political choice. You are choosing what defines the nation. So why was the music project considered completely safe by politicians, while the theater project was labeled a dangerous threat to the republic?
That is an excellent point, and it raises an important question about the nature of art. What's fascinating here is how the medium itself dictates the political reaction.
Right.
You're right that choosing what music to fund is an ideological choice. But the FMP dealt primarily in abstract sound. Symphonies are abstract.
Right.
Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, as powerful as it is, doesn't have lyrics about landlords raising the rent in Chicago. Teaching a child to play the violin doesn't explicitly critique a local power company's monopoly.
Right. If I play a cello solo, you might feel sad or uplifted, but you don't leave the concert hall thinking, I need to go join a labor union.
Exactly. I often think of it like this. The Federal Music Project was like the government funding a beautiful public park. Everyone can go there, It improves the neighborhood, and it's generally viewed as a universal good.
Sure.
The Federal Theater Project, especially the living newspapers, was like the government funding a public megaphone. And whoever is holding that megaphone gets to shout their specific opinions about housing and rent and agriculture. The FMP largely escaped political fire precisely because it didn't use literal spoken language to attack specific contemporary policies.
That makes perfect sense. It's the abstraction. You can't put a subpoena on a cello solo. It doesn't have a stated political platform.
The meaning in music is subjective to the listener. The meaning in a living newspaper about slumlords is objective, pointed, direct, and impossible to misinterpret.
And that directness was about to cost them everything.
Oh, absolutely.
The safety of the music project really highlights just how mounting the danger was surrounding the theater project. The cost of taking a side in 1930s America was becoming very, very apparent. So let's trace this escalation. How did the government start turning on its own creation?
The defining moment of this escalation, the moment where the political establishment truly blinks and steps in, happens in June 1937 with a production called The Cradle Will Rock.
Oh, this is such a legendary theatrical story. I love this.
It's incredible.
The Cradle Will Rock was a musical written by Mark Blitzstein, and it was highly political. It was explicitly pro-union, dealing with strikes, corrupt bosses, and the struggles of the working class. And it was being directed by Orson Welles and produced by John Houseman, the exact same duo behind the Voodoo Macbeth.
Yes, and as the opening night approached in New York, the political winds in Washington were already shifting.
They were getting nervous.
Very nervous. The WPA administrators were getting incredibly uncomfortable about funding such a militant, pro-labor musical. They knew conservative backlash was brewing, so on the very eve of its opening, citing mysterious budget cuts, WPA actually locks the doors.
They just locked them out.
Yes, they send guards to the Maxine Elliott Theater and physically lock the production out of its own venue.
It was a blatant act of federal censorship motivated entirely by political fear. They locked the costumes, the sets, the props. Everything was locked inside. But Welles and Houseman were not the kind of people to just go home quietly.
Not at all. The situation was incredibly tense. To make matters more complicated, the Actors Union, Actors Equity, stepped in and stated that because the federal government was no longer sanctioning the performance, the actors could not perform on stage.
Oh, wow.
If they stepped foot on an unsanctioned stage, they could lose their union cards and their livelihoods.
So they have no theater, no sets, no props, and their actors are literally forbidden from going on stage. It should have been completely dead.
It really should have been.
But what they do next is this incredible moment of theatrical rebellion. Houseman and Welles frantically rent another theater, the Venice Theater, just blocks away, on the fly on the night of the show. They marched the entire audience who had gathered outside the locked doors down the street. It's this massive, spontaneous parade.
And when they get inside, they still have the union problem. So Mark Blitzstein, the composer, walks out onto a bare stage with just a rented piano. He starts playing and singing the entire show himself.
Just him and the piano.
Right. But then, as he starts the first number, an actor in the audience stands up. Because the union rules said they couldn't perform on stage, it didn't say they couldn't sing for their seats.
I get chills thinking about it. One by one, the actors stand up in the aisles and the balconies, and they perform the entire musical from the audience seats, singing directly to the crowd around them.
It's just brilliant.
It was a massive triumph for the artists, but as you pointed out earlier, this event completely foreshadows the coming federal crackdown.
Absolutely. The government tried to censor them, and the artists publicly humiliated the government by doing the show anyway. It proved that the federal government was becoming deeply fundamentally uncomfortable with the very art it was paying for. It showed that the WPA had lost control of the megaphone.
Now, as we move past The Cradle Will Rock and dive into the specific charges of propaganda that followed, I want to pause for a second.
Sure.
When we look back at the historical record here, it is really important that we look at this through the eyes of the people living it. And before we dive into the politics here, I just want to explicitly state to you listening that we are impartially reporting this historical debate.
Right.
We're not endorsing either the left-wing or right-wing sides of this. We just want to present the case exactly as it was argued back then. The debate over whether this was propaganda was incredibly fierce, and honestly, both sides had arguments that made sense in the context of the 1930s. We're going to impartially look at why critics firmly believed this was an abuse of taxpayer funds and how the artists vehemently defended their work.
It's crucial to approach this objectively, because the debate struck at the core of what government's role should be. Let's start by laying out the case for the accusation. Why had critics in Congress, and many in the public, genuinely believe the Federal Theater Project was a propaganda machine?
Well, the most obvious piece of evidence, as we just discussed, is the repertoire itself. The living newspapers plainly favored New Deal positions.
They absolutely did.
If you put yourself in the shoes of a conservative congressman or even just a moderate taxpayer, and you see federal relief money funding plays that make landlords and utility companies look evil while championing housing regulations and labor unions, you don't see art. You see the Roosevelt administration paying out-of-work actors to stage live-action political advertisements for the president's agenda.
Furthermore, it is a historical fact that some Federal Theater Project companies did include actual Communist Party members, as well as a significant number of fellow travelers.
Let's define that term for a modern audience, because fellow traveler was a very specific phrase back then.
Yes, it was. A fellow traveler in the 1930s referred to someone who sympathized with the ideals of the Communist Party. Perhaps they supported strong labor unions, racial equality, and anti-fascism, but they were not official card-carrying members of the party.
Okay.
In the 1930s, especially during the Popular Front movement, the political left was incredibly strong in the theater world. So critics legitimately looked at this and questioned, why should taxpayer relief money gathered from all citizens be used to fund drama that argues only one side of live, fiercely debated political fights?
Especially with radical affiliations.
Exactly, especially when those productions are sometimes led by individuals with radical political affiliations.
That makes total sense. If you feel like your tax dollars are being used to actively campaign against your own political beliefs, you are going to call it propaganda. That's the case for the prosecution. But let's look at the other side. Let's lay out the defense against this accusation.
The primary defense from Flanagan and her supporters was one of scale and context. They pointed out that the project employed 10,000 people across the entire political spectrum.
It wasn't just a monolith.
Right. The FTP was not a monolith of radical leftists. It was a massive bureaucracy employing Republicans, Democrats, socialists, and people who had no interest in politics at all.
Right. And if you actually look at the full list of the 1,000 productions they mounted, much of the repertoire was entirely boringly apolitical.
Very true.
They were doing Shakespeare, they were doing standard vaudeville shows, they were doing children's marionette shows, they were doing historical dramas about the Founding Fathers. The living newspapers, while famous, were really only a fraction of the total output.
Defenders of the program argued that the communist label was being wielded by Congress as a blunt, opportunistic weapon.
A political strategy.
Exactly. They argued that the conservative bloc didn't actually care about a few radical actors in New York. Their real goal was to discredit the entire New Deal. And what better way to attack the Roosevelt administration than by attacking its most visible, vulnerable, and controversial cultural arm?
Make them look bad to the public.
Right. By painting the theater project as a communist plot, they could erode public support for the broader economic relief programs.
So what does this all mean when we synthesize these two viewpoints? It sounds like it was undeniably political art, and it was undeniably funded by a political administration. But the accusations against them, the idea that this was some massive orchestrated, top-down communist plot to overthrow the government via stage plays, were blown wildly out of proportion for political gain.
That is a very fair assessment. The art absolutely had a viewpoint, and it often challenged the capitalist status quo during a time of extreme economic suffering. But the political reaction to that art was weaponized far beyond the actual threat it posed.
And that weaponization brings us out of the theoretical debate in the newspapers and into the actual, literal trial of public art in the halls of Congress.
Let's look at exactly how this went down.
In 1938, the House Committee on Un-American Activities is officially formed.
The famous HUAC.
Yes. It is often referred to at the time as the Dies Committee, named after its chairman, a conservative Texas congressman named Martin Dies Jr.
And just to provide a little context, 1938 is an incredibly anxious time. You have fascism rising aggressively in Europe with Hitler and Mussolini.
Right.
You have communism firmly entrenched in the Soviet Union. And at home, the economy is still pretty unstable. So Congress creates this committee to investigate subversive activities, both fascist and communist, within the United States. But they don't start by looking for spies in the military, do they?
No, they don't. This committee doesn't waste any time, and they quickly turn their attention directly to the Works Progress Administration. And specifically, they zero in on the Federal Theater Project as their primary target. Which brings us to a highly significant date in American cultural history. December 6, 1938. Hallie Flanagan is subpoenaed and called to testify before the committee.
The historical weight of this moment is just profound. Think about what is happening here.
Exactly. I want to really emphasize this to you listening. A woman who was hired as an administrator to run a relief-funded theater project, a project designed to basically feed out-of-work actors, is the first witness ever called before America's first standing Un-American Activities investigation.
It's wild to think about.
The opening act of HUAC, a committee that would go on to define Cold War paranoia, is an interrogation of a college theater director.
It perfectly illustrates how deeply threatened the political establishment was by cultural influence. They saw narrative and storytelling as a genuine threat to national security.
They really did.
So Flanagan sits before this committee of congressmen, and she is bombarded with hostile questions, attempting to link her plays and her employees to communist influence.
But she doesn't back down. She doesn't apologize, and she doesn't cower. She parries their questions. She defends the artistic and social work of her project. And in a defining moment, she famously defines what they are doing not as communist propaganda, but as propaganda for democracy.
If we connect this phrase to the bigger picture, propaganda for democracy, it is incredibly revealing about her philosophy.
Oh, so.
Flanagan was too smart to sit there and deny that the work was persuasive. She conceded to the committee that the theater had an intent, it had a viewpoint, and it wanted to change minds.
Right. She's not playing dumb and saying, oh, we're perfectly neutral. It's just a play.
Exactly.
Yeah.
She owned the power of the medium.
Yeah.
But she vehemently insisted that its content was deeply, fundamentally patriotic.
Okay.
She argued that pointing out the flaws in the American system, like terrible, unsafe slum housing or unfair labor practices that exploited workers, and advocating for the improvement of the lives of average Americans is the most democratic thing a citizen can do.
That's a strong argument.
To her, fighting for a better, more equitable America was propaganda for democracy. She was arguing that democracy isn't a static thing you just accept, it's something you actively argue for and improve.
But of course, the committee wasn't there to engage in a high-minded philosophical debate with a Vassar professor about the nature of democratic art.
No, absolutely not.
The real purpose of these hearings wasn't fact-finding. They were building a public narrative to justify an execution. This was a direct, calculated attack on public art that told an uncomfortable truth about the failures of the American economy.
The committee basically provided a stage for critics to air every grievance against the project, regardless of context. And that attack proved to be incredibly effective in turning public and congressional opinion. Which brings us to the final act of this story.
Let's trace the timeline to the final, fatal shutdown of the project. Within months of Hallie Flanagan sitting in that witness chair and passionately defending her propaganda for democracy, Congress takes decisive, lethal action.
Effective June 30th, 1939, Congress terminates funding for the federal theater project entirely.
Just gone.
Gone. They don't just cut its budget, they don't demand a change in leadership, they legislate it completely out of existence.
It is the only one of the Federal 1 units to be completely terminated outright at the federal level.
And what happened to the other units on that exact same date is very telling.
What happened?
The Federal Music Project, the Art Project, the Historical Writing Project, they survived, but barely. They survived only by being pushed down to require state sponsorship. They ended their lives as purely federal, national projects on that exact same day, June 30, 1939.
So the grand national vision of Federal 1 was over.
Yes. The FMP limped along until about 1943 as the state-sponsored WPA music program, relying on local funds, but the era of the federal government attempting to build a unified national culture was definitively dead.
I think about why this matters so much to students of American politics today. This wasn't just about closing a few theaters or firing some actors. This was the first major successful cut in a much larger ideological war on the WPA and the New Deal itself.
It was the tip of the spear.
It perfectly highlights the profound vulnerability of government-funded culture.
It sets a massive precedent. It demonstrates that when the government funds art, that art exists entirely at the mercy of the political winds.
Right.
If the art bites the hand that feeds it, even if it's doing so to advocate for the very citizens the government is supposed to represent, that hand will eventually snap shut.
There's this tragic, lingering irony to the whole story. The Federal Theater Project was killed because it was too good at its job.
That's a real tragedy.
It reflected the real, messy, painful lives of the people it served so accurately and with such a loud, undeniable voice that it absolutely terrified the establishment.
To synthesize what we've explored today across these two massive programs,
Hmm.
the WPA era proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the government could successfully fund and execute massive cultural works.
Yes, it did.
They proved they could reach tens of millions of people with free symphonies, providing vital community enrichment and education. They proved they could create groundbreaking, structurally innovative theater that gave voice to the voiceless. They fed the culturally starved.
But it also proved that there's a strict, invisible boundary on what kind of culture is acceptable to the state.
Exactly. It proved that while symphonies, violin lessons for children, and the preservation of Appalachian folk songs were seen as safe, elevating, and neutral documentary theater that challenged the economic status quo, made powerful enemies.
Which makes sense.
This moment in 1939, with the death of the Federal Theater Project, is where America fundamentally decided that public art, which tells the unvarnished truth, comes with a steep and ultimately fatal political price.
It leaves you with a lot to think about, especially as we navigate our own modern media landscape. Consider this. If the government were to fund a massive federal internet project today, just to employ out-of-work creators, writers, video makers, and, podcasters, who would get to decide what content is safe, like Sokoloff symphonies, and who would get to label certain content as dangerous propaganda, like Flanagan's living newspapers, and more importantly, who gets to draw that line for you?